Hello, in this video we are going to discuss how the Spirent TestCenter user can reserve, release, and manage port reservation resources within the Spirent TestCenter framework. So to reserve ports in the system, you can reserve ports across as many chassis as you would like, and you do this over your IP-based network. So your PC containing the Spirent TestCenter GUI, namely this, needs to have IP connectivity to the Spirent TestCenter chassis or chassis. So the way that you reserve ports inside of the system is you launch the GUI, and then you can either come up here to the chassis button, or you can come down here to the launch pad where you can connect to a chassis and reserve ports. So when you do this, this shows you the select ports dialog, and there's several attributes here. You can add a chassis here, you can connect to a port set, you can see here what current chassis are selected. You can add offline ports, which are virtual ports, and you can also add default L2 or L3 traffic, which will basically be in a full mesh across all of the reserve ports that you have selected. So to get started, click Add Chassis and type in the IP address of your chassis. And when you do this, you see an Explorer tree format. This will expand the tree. If it's not expanded, you can just expand it. That'll create a connection to the chassis. It will scan the chassis for available modules. And here you see a 4100 gig module. So I'm going to click the port to go ahead and reserve this. Currently this says to be reserved. And I don't want any default traffic on it, so I'll just go ahead and hit OK. Now, if we go back to this dialog, you'll notice that I currently have the reserve on my port, and this will show me who currently has the reserve. In this case, it's just myself. But you can use this to actually see who has the reserve on what resources in the system. So the idea is each major branch represents a chassis, each sub-branch represents a card or a module, and each leaf represents an individual port that the user wants to reserve. This can happen over as many chassis as you would like within the system. So I can do some other options too. If I wanted to kick a user off of a port, I can right click on that port, and if the reserve was not me, I could force the user off. I could add multiple chassis from a file. So this is very useful for creating large numbers of test and port reserves in the system. And I can also disconnect a chassis from here. And also, once I'm disconnected, I can then delete that chassis from this list. In addition, if I wanted to, I can create offline ports. So currently this is an online port, but if I wanted to create an offline port is exactly the same as an online port, except it's virtual. You don't actually need a chassis to create an offline port, and this allows you to configure your test ahead of time before you have the ability to connect to the chassis. So the way I do this is I create a port for use offline, and I can create combinations of online and offline ports. So I can say how many ports do I want to create, what is the model, so is it Ethernet copper, is it Ethernet fiber, is it 10 gig, 40 gig, 100 gig, POS or ATM or fiber channel. I can then give this card an index number and a suffix. So here you can see port config 1 is my default name, but I can name this port, and I can also turn off index if I choose, and I can create a suffix. So this allows me to name my ports across large numbers of ports. So to unreserve a resource, all you do is you come back to the chassis select dialog and you uncheck the resource. The port group will then reboot, and depending upon the module, within a few minutes, this port will be now available to the next user. In addition, you can also see the version of firmware that is currently on the chassis. In this case, it's 3.427 build 732. So this is a video describing how to reserve and release ports within the Spirent TestCenter management system.